The iron doors of the Olomouc prison didn't just close, they screamed a final warning to anyone who still believed that the truth could set them free. Inside the freezing dampness of a cell carved from unforgiving stone sat Jan Sarkander, a man who held a secret so heavy it was literally crushing the life out of him. He wasn't a soldier or a rebel leader, but a simple priest caught in the gears of a religious war that was currently tearing Europe apart limb from limb. The year was 1620, and the air in Moravia was thick with the scent of gunpowder and paranoia. Because when empires collide, they don't just want your land, they want your soul, and they definitely want your secrets. Jan Sarkander was a man of God who found himself trapped in a nightmare where his only crime was his silence, and that silence was about to become the most dangerous thing in the world. Imagine being told that if you just speak a few words, the pain will stop and the chains will fall. But if you stay quiet, you will be broken until there is nothing left but a memory. This is the story of a man who looked into the eyes of his executioners and chose a secret over his own survival. The 30 Years' War was a monster that fed on suspicion, and Jan was the perfect bait for its hunger. He had been the parish priest of Olomouc, a place where the lines between Catholic and Protestant were drawn in blood, and every neighbor was a potential spy. When the Polish Cossacks swept through the lands like a plague of fire and steel, they spared Olomouc because Jan walked out to meet them, carrying nothing but the Blessed Sacrament. To the Protestants, this wasn't a miracle, it was a betrayal, and they were convinced that Jan had secretly orchestrated the invasion through his private conversations with the aristocracy. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted proof of a conspiracy, and they believed that proof was locked away inside his mind behind the sacred seal of the confessional. In their eyes, he wasn't a martyr, he was a traitor hiding behind a collar, and they were prepared to use every tool of agony known to man to make him talk.
But Jan knew something they didn't understand, because to a priest, the confessional is a grave where secrets go to die, and the seal is a bond that not even the threat of the rack can break. They dragged him from his home while the world was still dark and forced him into the bowels of the city, where the walls were stained with the tears of those who had come before him. There was no trial in the way we think of it today. There was only the interrogation, and the interrogation was a theater of cruelty designed to make a man beg for the end. They asked him who he talked to and what they said, but Jan remained as silent as the stone walls around him. His quietness infuriated them because it was a form of power they couldn't control, and every minute he stayed silent was a minute where they felt their own authority slipping away. They needed him to be a villain so they could justify their own violence, but Jan just looked at them with eyes that seemed to see a world far beyond the reach of their torches. As the first day of his imprisonment turned into a week, the pressure began to mount because the people were starting to whisper about the priest who wouldn't break. The authorities realized that if they couldn't get him to talk through words, they would have to make his body scream for him. They brought in the professional tormentors, men who knew exactly how much weight a human bone could take before it snapped like dry kindling. They showed him the instruments of the question and explained in graphic detail what each one would do to his flesh and his nerves. They expected him to tremble, and they expected him to weep, but instead he prayed with a focused intensity that made the guards feel like they were the ones who were trapped. The tension in the room was a physical weight because everyone knew that once the first blow was struck, there would be no going back, and the soul of Jan Sarkander would either rise or be crushed under the weight of a secret he refused to betray. They began with the lesser tortures, thinking that a small taste of pain would be enough to crack the resolve of a middle-aged priest. They deprived him of sleep and food, hoping that exhaustion would dull his will and make him slip up during the endless cycles of questioning. But Jan's mind was a fortress, and his faith was the moat that kept them out. He told them that he could not reveal what was said in confession because it didn't belong to him, it belonged to God. and to break that seal would be a fate far worse than anything they could do to his body. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a spiritual war for the very essence of his identity. He was being asked to choose between his life and his integrity, and every time he chose the latter, the anger of his captors grew into a blinding rage. They were losing the battle of wills, and they knew that the only way to win was to increase the stakes until the human spirit simply gave out. The city of Olomouc held its breath as the rumors of what was happening in the dungeon leaked out into the streets. People who had once hated Jan were now starting to feel a strange sense of awe at his endurance, because even his enemies had to admit that his courage was undeniable. But the men in charge couldn't afford to have a hero. They needed a confession to validate their war and to secure their grip on power. They decided that the time for talking was over and the time for the extraordinary question had begun. This meant the rack and the fire and the slow, systematic destruction of a human being in the name of political stability. Jan was led into the chamber where the air smelled of old blood and rusted iron, and he knew that he was walking into his own passion. He looked at the heavy wooden frame of the rack, and he knew that within the hour his body would never be the same again, but his eyes remained fixed on a light that no one else in that room could see. The torturers stepped forward, and the first turn of the crank echoed through the room like a gunshot. Jan's breath hitched as his joints were pulled to their absolute limit, and the sound of his own ligaments stretching filled his ears. The interrogator leaned in close, his voice a silk-wrapped blade, asking him once more for the names of the conspirators. All Jan had to do was whisper one name and the tension would be released, and he would be given wine and a warm bed. But instead of a name, Jan offered a prayer for his tormentors, which was the ultimate insult to their power. They turned the crank again, and the room seemed to spin as the pain reached a crescendo that defied description. This wasn't just a physical battle anymore. It was a cosmic struggle between the silence of the sacred and the noise of the worldly. And as the first part of his ordeal reached its peak, the question wasn't just whether Jan would survive, but whether any human soul could withstand the weight of such a divine burden. The sound of a human body being stretched past its breaking point is a noise you never forget, because it's not just the sound of tearing skin, but the sound of a soul being pulled out of its hiding place. As the rack groaned under the tension in that dark Olomouc dungeon, Jan Sarkander became a living map of human suffering, and yet his map had no path leading to a confession. The interrogators were stunned, because by all laws of biology and psychology, Jan should have been screaming for mercy or babbling every secret he had ever heard. Instead, he drifted into a state of semi-consciousness, where the only words that escaped his cracked lips were the names of Jesus, Mary, and Anna. To the judges standing in the shadows, this wasn't just stubbornness, it was a terrifying display of a power they didn't understand. They were using the most advanced methods of pain known to the 17th century, but they were fighting a man who had already surrendered his life to something eternal. Frustrated by the rack's failure, the lead prosecutor ordered the torturers to move to the Scott screws and the application of fire. They didn't just want to stretch him anymore, they wanted to burn the truth out of him. They took torches and held them to his sides and his chest until the smell of scorched flesh filled the chamber, making even the guards turn their heads in disgust. Imagine the psychological warfare of that moment, where every nerve in your body is screaming in a symphony of white-hot fire, and a man stands over you promising that all of this goes away with a single yes. But Jan knew that a yes to them was a no to God. He understood that if he betrayed the seal of the confessional, he would be saving his body only to lose the very thing that made him Jan Sarkander. He was protecting the secrets of people who might not even have been his friends, because the principle of the thing was larger than the individuals involved. The interrogation sessions lasted for hours, stretching into days, and each time Jan was brought back to his cell, he was less of a man and more of a ghost. His limbs were disjointed and his skin was a blackened ruin, but his mind remained an impenetrable vault. The authorities were now in a panic because the news of the invincible priest was spreading throughout the region like a wildfire. If Jan died without speaking, he wouldn't just be a dead prisoner, he would be a martyr whose blood would act as seeds for a new rebellion. They tried to switch tactics, moving from the stick to the carrot by bringing in doctors to treat his wounds just enough so that he could feel the pain of the next session. They brought in fellow clergymen to argue that perhaps God would forgive a small slip of the tongue under such extreme circumstances. They tried to gaslight him into believing that he was actually hurting the church by staying silent. But Jan's response was always a quiet, devastating clarity that left the scholars speechless. He told them that the seal of confession is not a piece of paper that can be torn. It is a spiritual boundary that exists outside of time. He reminded them that if a priest could be tortured into revealing the sins of a penitent, then the entire foundation of the faith would crumble, and no soul would ever feel safe seeking forgiveness again. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for every person who had ever whispered their darkest shames in the dark of a wooden box. This shifted the stakes of the story from a political trial to a cosmic battle for the sanctity of the human conscience. The judges realized they weren't just interrogating a man, they were trying to put a hole in the sky, and the sky wasn't moving. The cruelty reached its absolute peak when they decided to use the Iron Maiden of the mind, which was the constant presence of death without the release of it. They would drag him to the execution grounds, show him the fire and the stake, and then at the last second, drag him back to the dungeon for more questioning. This psychological near miss is designed to break the nervous system, making the victim crave death so much that they will do anything to reach it. Yet Jan didn't crave the end, he accepted it. This lack of fear was his ultimate weapon. When you no longer fear what men can do to your body, you become the most dangerous person in the room because you have reached a level of freedom that your captors will never know. The guards began to look at him with a mixture of horror and reverence, with some even crossing themselves when they had to touch his mangled frame. By the third week of torture, Jan Sarkander's body was essentially a wreckage of bone and burnt tissue. He could no longer walk, and his hands, which had once blessed thousands, were useless weights at his sides. The Protestant authorities were now facing a PR nightmare of epic proportions, because the Catholic world was beginning to scream for justice. They needed a way out, but their pride wouldn't let them just release him, and their fear wouldn't let them kill him outright without a confession. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, while Jan, in his actual cell, was arguably the only free man in Olomouc. He spent his final conscious hours in a state of mystical ecstasy, reporting that he felt no pain, only a profound sense of peace, as if he were being held by hands far gentler than those of the torturers.
The final attempt to break him was the most desperate. They brought in his own family members or those he cared for, hoping that the sight of their grief would do what the fire could not. They told him that his silence was causing more war and more death, and that the blood of the innocent was on his hands. This is the ultimate test for a good man, to be told that his goodness is actually a form of evil. Jan wept then, but he didn't yield. He knew that the truth is not something you negotiate with, and that once you start trading pieces of your soul to stop the pain, there is eventually nothing left to save. He looked at the world one last time from the window of his pain, and he saw a truth that made the fire look cold and the rack look weak. He was ready for the end, but the end was going to be much more lingering and much more transformative than anyone expected. As Jan's breath became shallow and the light in his eyes began to flicker, the authorities realized they had lost. They had destroyed the vessel, but they hadn't touched the contents. They had proven that they could kill, but they hadn't proven that they were right.
The silence of Jan Sarkander was now a deafening roar that was shaking the foundations of the city, and the men who had ordered his torture were starting to look over their shoulders, wondering when the consequences would arrive. They had tried to silence a priest, but they had accidentally created a legend that would outlive their empires by centuries. But before the final breath was drawn, there was one last revelation. One last moment of defiance that would cement Jan's place in history forever. And it happened in a way that no one saw coming. The end did not come with a sudden blow or a final dramatic execution. It came as a slow, agonizing victory of the spirit over the limits of biology. For 4 weeks, Jan Sarkander had survived what should have killed any man in hours, lingering in a state between life and death that felt almost supernatural. His body was a ruin, his organs were failing from the internal damage of the rack, and his skin was a testament to the cruelty of the flame. Yet he remained conscious enough to look his captors in the eye. The authorities were terrified. They had wanted a confession, but instead they had created a living miracle that they couldn't explain and couldn't hide. On March 17, 1620, the air in the dungeon changed, growing still and heavy, as the man who refused to speak finally prepared to enter a silence that no human hand could ever break. In his final moments, Jan didn't curse the men who had broken his bones or the judges who had signed his death warrant. Witnesses whispered that his face, despite the scars and the trauma, took on a glow that made the torches in the room seem dim and flickering. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He had become a mirror, reflecting the darkness of his persecutors back at them until they couldn't bear to look. They had tried to strip him of his dignity, but in his absolute vulnerability, he had found a strength that was unshakable. He died not as a victim of a political conspiracy, but as a sentinel of the human conscience. The moment his heart stopped, a shockwave went through Olomouc, not because a man died, but because the secret he died for remained safe, locked away forever in a grave that no interrogation could reach.
The aftermath of Jan Sarkander's death was an explosion of irony that his executioners never anticipated. They had tortured him to prevent a war and to stabilize their power, but the news of his white martyrdom became the rallying cry that unified their enemies. Jan Sarkander became the patron saint of the Moravian people, a symbol of resistance against any power, religious or political, that tried to invade the private sanctuary of the soul. The very room where he was tortured was eventually turned into a chapel, a place of prayer where the echoes of his screams were replaced by the sounds of hymns. The instruments of his agony were preserved not as trophies of the state, but as relics of a man who proved that there are things in this world more valuable than the breath in our lungs. But the story doesn't end with his burial, because the mystery of what Jan actually knew continues to haunt the halls of history. Was there a real conspiracy? Did he hold the names of generals and kings who were plotting to overthrow the government? Or was he truly just an innocent man caught in the paranoid age? We will never know the answer, and that is precisely the point. By choosing to die rather than speak, Jan ensured that the truth remained between him and God, leaving the world with a question that forces every generation to look at their own values. He showed us that the ultimate power isn't held by the person with the whip or the torch, but by the person who can look at the fire and say, "You can have my life, but you cannot have my integrity." Centuries later, the Catholic Church recognized this sacrifice, and in 1995, Pope John Paul II traveled to Olomouc to canonize Jan Sarkander as a saint. The Pope spoke to a crowd of thousands, standing just miles from the spot where the priest had been broken, and he reminded the world that Jan's silence was a form of speech, a loud, clear declaration that the human conscience is sacred and must be protected at all costs. In a modern world where our privacy is constantly under threat and our secrets are often traded for convenience, the story of Jan Sarkander feels more relevant than ever.
He is a reminder that some things are worth the ultimate price, and that the most powerful thing a person can do is stand their ground when the whole world is trying to move them.
The men who tortured Jan are gone, their names forgotten or buried in the footnotes of dusty history books. The empires they fought for have crumbled into ash, and the borders they tried to protect have been redrawn a dozen times over. But the name of Jan Sarkander remains etched in stone and spirit. He didn't write a book, he didn't lead an army, and he didn't change the laws of the land through a speech. He changed the world by staying quiet. He proved that a single soul anchored by faith and a refusal to betray a trust is more durable than any empire and more resilient than any flame. His trial wasn't just a dark moment in history, it was a light that showed us the true depth of human potential. As we look back at the dark trial that silenced the priest, we realize that the interrogators failed in the most spectacular way possible. They wanted to erase him, but they made him immortal. They wanted to expose his secrets, but they made his silence a legend. They wanted to break his spirit, but they only succeeded in freeing it. Jan Sarkander walked into that dungeon as a simple man of faith, but he walked out of history as a giant. The next time you find yourself pressured to compromise who you are or what you believe, remember the man in the Olomouc dungeon. Remember the rack, the fire, and the priest who knew that some secrets are worth dying for. Because when everything else is stripped away, your character is the only thing you truly own.